Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Friday, October 10th, 2025, and on Fridays we talk about human behavior and justifications. I briefly discussed a couple of key points about the life of Jane Goodall yesterday, the famous primatologist who passed away on October 1st this year. And today's companion piece will be a bit longer, trying to show a little bit of the connection between some of Jane's work and the capacity to and the difficulties, if you will, to transcend tribalism amongst humans. And the reason it's so difficult is because, on the one hand, we are deeply wired to be tribal, but not just genetically, but even more so because of the overwhelming force and power of culture. And of course, we necessarily require culture in order to survive. We require the caregivers, the languages that they speak, the technologies that they have at their disposal, and the adaptations to our natural environments. And yet, at the same time, we sort of run the risk, don't we? Just as our bodies do, physically or physiologically, in terms of, having our immune systems compromised. We can also be exposed to harmful or destructive ideas or cultural memes, which might invade our minds and overwhelm our, if you will, our cognitive immune systems. They don't always work especially well. And sometimes we allow for the arrival, the invasion of these destructive ideas or thoughts that we really ought to eliminate. So, for example, thoughts of suicide. That's not a particularly helpful or adaptive way to respond to life's challenges. In fact, unfortunately, a colleague of mine, and a friend of mine, really, from our university, a teaching colleague and professor, took his own life back in 2007. And at his memorial, I was talking to his father, and his father shared some words I'll never forget. He said, it's such a permanent solution to a temporary problem. At least that's how he viewed it. Now, it's kind of difficult to say then whether or not suicide is a particularly human or unique human problem as such. And there's a lot of debate whether other animal species have the capacity to commit suicide, to act specifically to act intentionally in committing suicide. And some behaviors certainly might strike us as unhealthy, but the thing is that suicide, and the reason that there's such a great debate, suicide implies that we can understand the animal's mindset and intentions. And unfortunately, other animals, if they do die, commit suicide, or we think they might have, they don't leave behind suicide notes. They don't communicate, obviously, in the way that we do as human beings. It's only among humans, to the best of our knowledge, that we have what's known as a theory of the mind. That is the ability then to adopt another's point of view and understand their reasoning and their purpose for behaving a certain way. And in contrast, to the best of our knowledge, no one's ever documented a chimpanzee or an ape, for example, committing suicide. And then that brings me back to Jane Goodall's work, because she's carefully documented, probably more than any other human on the planet, fascinating array of different behaviors amongst chimpanzees in her work over several decades, but most notably in the Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania, some of which I mentioned briefly yesterday. But one of the most profound observations that I didn't discuss yesterday was the fact that Dr. Goodall observed at times some rather extreme violence amongst the chimpanzees. So, for example, a mother might actually kill the infant, the offspring of another female, even within her own troop, in order to maintain her position of dominance. And the chimps would sometimes, of course, also hunt other smaller monkeys or other mammals as such, as Jane confirmed, that they were indeed meat eaters, contrary to public perception previously. But most remarkably, I think, in her work, Dr. Goodall described at great length the many interactions amongst, for example, mothers and daughters, which sound almost human in terms of everything from their disciplinary practices and the frustrations that they had, to the deep empathy and gentleness that they'd often display as well. So you really have to read her first-person narratives, her accounts of these interactions to appreciate the deep similarities with human behavior. And ditto for her accounts of young chimps at play, or the dominant male's behaviors, and much more. So indeed, if you read any of Dr. Goodall's work, she almost sounds like, well, she sounds like an anthropologist offering detailed descriptions of complex sets of human relationships and sexual relationships and different types of social networks and the special alliances that might be forged and the conflicts that would sometimes flare up and so much more. Except that she was describing chimpanzees and not humans. And this leads to my key point today. Because on April 25th, 2018, my university granted an honorary doctorate to Jane Goodall right here at Western University in London, Ontario. And as the associate dean, the associate academic dean at the time, I had the pleasure and the privilege of being on stage for the ceremony. And so there I am with Dr. Goodall. Even better, I had the chance to meet her backstage. And even better than that, because she didn't, we had plenty of time before the ceremony. She didn't have, any other, people that were really close to her personally there. And so I had the opportunity to meet her and speak with her kind of, tete-a-tete, almost like privately, one-on-one, for about 10 to 15 minutes. So we had a lovely conversation. And after the sort of the normal exchange of pleasantries, I decided to sort of go for it. What I mean by that is I asked her to elaborate a little bit further on some of her work. But I had a special question in mind that I'd been wanting to ask her. I never thought I'd get a chance to meet her, and here I was in conversation with her, so I thought, why not? So remember, she'd spent decades studying chimpanzees and their natural habitats and carefully documenting basically almost everything that we know these days about their relationships, about their social structures and hierarchies, and even the lineages of several specific chimps, all of whom, of course, she named. And I mention that because you'll scarcely find another person on the planet as sympathetic and empathetic toward chimpanzees and animals across the spectrum as Jane Goodall. So to cut to the chase, after she spoke a bit about her field work, I asked her something kind of like the following. I said, Jane, she insisted that I call her Jane, in your countless observations of chimpanzee conflicts and their strategies for dealing with conflict, did you ever see them try to explain themselves to the others they were in conflict with, or to the other chimps, or to the troop as a whole, in terms of what they were doing and why they were doing it? And she understood immediately what I was getting at, what I was asking, and without hesitation, she reported she never saw that kind of explanation, that kind of behavior. And so I repeated the question in a slightly different way. I said, you mean the chimps never tried to justify or defend their behavior to another chimp or to the troop as a whole? Never, she replied. And she could do a good job of imitating chimps and their communication styles, but she made it quite clear that for all of their similarities to human beings, there was still a fundamental difference. And that's what she knew I was sort of asking about, and that's what she confirmed. So the chimps, again, in her own work, the chimps, she documented how they made tools and how they cared for each other and how they even waged war at times, but they did not, in her view, use anything that remotely resembles the capacities that we humans have to rationalize and justify behavior to the others of our species, or to anybody else. And so as far as we can determine, so for example, while we share so much of our DNA with the chimps, and they're about our closest living genetic relatives along with bonobos, there still exists this fundamental divide that comes down to our brains and the nature of human culture. So yes, again, chimps can make tools and they can even learn to paint and much more. But as best we can determine, they never improve upon these strategies and these abilities. In other words, nothing ever really changes in their approaches, for example, to tool making. And if you take away the paintbrush, they don't seem to be all that interested in asking for a new one or learning how to make a new one for that matter. And while they can be remarkably innovative, they make these incredibly comfortable beds each night that they're able to sleep on, and with some intricate tying of leaves and much more. Their basic lodging strategy hasn't changed for centuries. And that's not a diss, it's just a reflection of their genetics and their adaptations to their natural environments. But humans have learned to adapt not just because of their genetics, but also because of their culture. That is, the difference is with humans, they're able to invent all kinds of new technologies and then ultimately even change their habitats and their environments and their ecosystems at levels beyond what any, even the most intelligent or the most genius chimpanzee could ever conceive of doing, or perhaps could ever do. But here's the final point. It's not because of any one of us as individuals, but rather because of what our unique capacities are for social learning. In other words, what we share and what we create and then transmit through our cultures, the cultures of the tribes to which we all belong. And that's what makes all the difference for us. As humans, we have all kinds of cultural ratchets that allow us, not just trial and error, but then to learn from those trial and errors and then to share that information and teach it to others and document what we've learned, first in oral traditions and then in all kinds of written and other symbolic forms. All of which then allows us to improve upon and to build upon the accumulated ideas and skills and technologies within our own lifetimes and certainly across the generations. And just as important, with humans, we not only document what we've learned and what seems to work better, but we also typically document the why aspects as well. We develop the principles and the rules and the instructions that explain the mechanisms involved, the cause and effect relationships, and simply the reasons for why we prefer this or that approach to solving problem X. In short, it's our cultures and our specific tribes then that provide us with far more information and knowledge and ideologies and technologies and material resources completely unknown to the rest of the animal kingdom. And this has huge implications then, not just for the human condition, but for the fate of the world. To be continued. As ever, in the meantime, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. See you next time. Peace.